Would you recognize the truth in a child's face when everyone else is celebrating? Chicago, November 11, 1919. Under bright victory banners, 8-year-old Eleanor Walsh stands in a white dress, hands clenched. As the parade roars, her father sits 3 blocks away at a kitchen table with his service revolver, trapped in a war that followed him home. What begins as a photograph for the church newsletter uncovers a silence binding a dozen veterans, and a choice that will ripple across generations. Stay with me. This is a dramatized narrative inspired by real histories, and tonight you'll hear the full story behind the picture that saved 6 lives. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, because they are dramatized narratives inspired by real history and packed with hard-earned life lessons, hit subscribe, like, and tell me which city you're watching from. It helps this channel keep uncovering the human truth behind the photographs. The photograph shows 7 children laughing beneath victory banners in Chicago, 1919. But look closer at the little girl in the white dress, second from the left. She's the only one not smiling, and if you stay until the end, you'll discover why her eyes hold a secret that would haunt an entire neighborhood for decades. This is the story of Eleanor Walsh, age 8, the daughter who carried a burden no child should ever carry. A burden that began the moment her father stepped off the train from France. The photograph was discovered in 2003, tucked inside a Bible at St. Michael's Church in Chicago's South Side. Written on the back in faded pencil, "The day we pretended everything was fine. November 11th, 1919. But look at Eleanor's hands. They're clenched so tight her knuckles are white. Because Eleanor knew something the other children didn't. She knew that victory at home looked nothing like the banners promised. 3 blocks away from where this photo was taken, her father sat alone in their kitchen with a loaded pistol on the table. And Eleanor had exactly 2 hours before he would make a decision that would change everything. But what none of them knew, not even Eleanor, was that her father wasn't the only veteran on that street fighting an invisible war. There were 12 others, and by sunset, only 7 would still be alive. This is the story of how one 8-year-old girl saved 6 lives with a single photograph. But to understand how, we need to go back 6 months earlier, to the day Chicago welcomed its heroes home, and Eleanor's childhood ended forever. April 17th, 1919. Chicago's Union Station exploded with celebration. Eleanor stood on the platform in her Sunday best dress, the one her mother had sewn from curtain fabric because they couldn't afford new clothes anymore. Her mother, Catherine Walsh, gripped her hand so tightly it hurt. Eleanor didn't complain. She'd learned not to complain about anything since the telegrams started arriving on their street. 14 families, 14 yellow envelopes, 14 windows with gold stars. But the Walsh family was lucky. That's what everyone said. Patrick Walsh was coming home alive. Eleanor watched the train pull in, black smoke billowing against the April sky. Soldiers poured out, some on crutches, some carried on stretchers, all of them greeted by a wave of sound so loud it felt like the world was splitting open. Somewhere in that crowd was her father, the man she'd been writing letters to for 2 years, the man whose photograph sat on their mantel, showing a smiling Irishman with kind eyes and strong hands. Then she saw him. And nothing was the same. Patrick Walsh didn't smile. He didn't wave. He moved through the crowd like a ghost passing through walls, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. When Catherine ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck, he stood rigid as stone. When Eleanor whispered, "Daddy?" he looked down at her with the expression of a man seeing a stranger. That night, Eleanor heard her mother crying in the kitchen. Through the thin walls of their tenement apartment, she heard her father's voice, low and broken. "I can't do this, Kathy. I can't pretend I'm the man who left." And her mother's response, desperate and pleading, "The war is over, Patrick. You're home now. You're safe." But Eleanor, lying in her small bed with her doll clutched to her chest, knew her mother was wrong. She could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating as smoke. The war wasn't over. It had followed her father home, and it was living in their apartment like an unwelcome guest that no one knew how to make leave. Over the next weeks, Eleanor learned the new rules of their household. Don't slam doors. Don't speak too loudly. Don't ask why Daddy sleeps with all the lights on. Don't mention the way he jumps at sudden sounds. Don't notice when he disappears for hours and comes back smelling like the speakeasy 3 streets over, even though prohibition made drinking illegal. Don't talk about the fact that your father, who used to build you doll houses from scrap wood and sing Irish songs while cooking Sunday breakfast, now can't look at you without his hands starting to shake. The neighborhood called it soldier's heart in hushed whispers. Some called it shell shock. Most didn't call it anything at all because talking about it felt like admitting that the victory everyone celebrated was somehow incomplete. How could you say the war was won when the men who won it came back broken? By November, 12 veterans on Eleanor Street were fighting the same invisible battle. James Murphy, who lived next door, would wake the entire building with his screaming nightmares. Thomas O'Brien down the hall drank himself unconscious every night. William Clark, just 19 years old, hadn't spoken a single word since returning from Belleau Wood. And every single one of them was drowning in a silence that their families didn't know how to break. Then came November 11th, the first anniversary of Armistice Day. The city planned a massive celebration, victory parades, brass bands, children waving flags. The mayor declared it a day of joy and thanksgiving. But that morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of her father loading his service revolver in the kitchen. She crept to the doorway and watched him sit at their small wooden table, the gun placed carefully in front of him like a dinner plate. The early morning light coming through their window made everything look gray and unreal. Patrick Walsh stared at that gun the way a drowning man stares at deep water. Eleanor's heart hammered in her small chest. She'd heard the whispers. 3 veterans in Chicago had already killed themselves since coming home. One just last week, leaving behind a wife and twin babies. The newspapers didn't report it. Nobody talked about it. But Eleanor knew. Children always know the things adults try to hide. She backed away slowly, got dressed, and ran to find her mother at the market. But Catherine was gone, lost somewhere in the crowds gathering for the parade. Eleanor stood on the corner of Ashland and Division, surrounded by celebration, knowing that 3 blocks away, her father was making a calculation that would end with either his death or his survival. And she had no idea how to stop it. Chicago, 1919, was a city of contradictions. On the surface, everything gleamed with victory. The war was won, the boys were home, American flags hung from every window. But underneath, in the tenement apartments where the working families lived, a different war was being fought. A war without battlefields or enemies, where men fought themselves in the darkness of their own minds. Eleanor ran through streets packed with celebrating crowds, past the butcher shop where her mother bought their weekly meat ration, past the church where Father O'Malley still gave sermons about sacrifice and duty. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached. When she finally found her mother, Catherine was standing with a group of neighborhood women, all of them wearing their best dresses and forced smiles. Mrs. Murphy stood with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. Mrs. O'Brien clutched her rosary beads so tightly her knuckles were bone white. Mrs. Clark hadn't brushed her hair in days, and Eleanor's mother, Eleanor Walsh, looked like a woman who'd aged 10 years in 6 months. "Mama," Eleanor gasped, tugging on her mother's sleeve. But before she could say more, the parade began. Soldiers marched down the street in perfect formation, the same men who just months ago couldn't sleep without nightmares, now forced to smile and wave like heroes from a storybook. The crowd cheered, children waved flags, and Eleanor watched her mother's face crumble for just a moment before she rebuilt it into something that looked like pride. Later, historians would note that the 1919 Armistice Day celebrations marked a turning point in how America viewed its veterans. But what the history books wouldn't capture was what happened in the small apartments after the parades ended, when the flags were folded away and the brass bands went silent, when families sat across dinner tables from men who'd seen things that made them strangers to themselves. Eleanor's moment came at 2 in the afternoon. Her mother was pulled into organizing activities at the community center, where all the children were gathering for a celebration. Someone hung victory banners across the entrance. Someone else brought an old camera to capture the moment for the church newsletter. "Go play with the other children, Eleanor," her mother said, her voice hollow. "Everything's going to be fine." But Eleanor knew it wasn't. She'd left her father alone with that gun for 4 hours now. 4 hours was an eternity. 4 hours was long enough to make any decision, no matter how final. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell everyone that the celebration was a lie, that victory was hollow when the men who won it couldn't survive the peace. But she was 8 years old, and 8-year-olds didn't have words for things like moral injury and psychological trauma. So she stood with the other children beneath those bright banners and felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her chest like stones. That's when she noticed she wasn't the only one. Timothy Murphy, age 10, stood rigid as a board, his eyes darting toward his apartment building every few seconds. His father, James, had been a sergeant in the infantry. Timothy had the same white-knuckled grip Eleanor recognized from her own mirror. Sarah O'Brien, just 7 years old, twisted her dress in her hands compulsively. Her father, Thomas, had been a medic who'd seen too many boys die on his operating table. Daniel Clark, 13, kept his eyes fixed on the ground. His older brother William had come home from France unable to speak, his voice stolen by whatever horrors he'd witnessed in the Argonne forest. 4 children, 4 families, 4 fathers fighting to survive in a world that expected them to simply forget what they'd seen and be grateful they'd survived. Eleanor made a decision in that moment that would change everything. She walked up to Timothy Murphy and whispered, "Your father has the look too, doesn't he?" Timothy's eyes snapped to hers, wide and terrified and relieved all at once. He nodded. "Mine too," Eleanor said. And then, louder so Sarah and Daniel could hear, "All of them do." The photographer called for everyone to gather. The adults wanted a picture of victory, of hope, of children who represented the future that all those soldiers had fought to protect. But Eleanor had a different plan. While the other children smiled and waved their flags, Eleanor looked directly into the camera with all the truth she could muster in her 8-year-old face. Because she'd realized something in that moment. This photograph wouldn't just be a document of a celebration. It would be evidence, proof of what nobody wanted to say out loud. That the war hadn't ended for the men who fought it. That victory came with a cost nobody wanted to calculate. And that their children were carrying burdens that were crushing them under the weight of secrets too heavy for small shoulders. The flash popped. The moment was captured. And Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that when she got home, she would either find her father alive or she would find him dead. There was no in-between anymore. The space for hope had narrowed to a point so sharp it could cut. But what Eleanor didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that at that exact moment, 3 blocks away, her father was making a discovery that would change everything. Patrick Walsh had been sitting at that table for 6 hours, the revolver cold and heavy in his hand, when he heard something through the thin walls. Sobbing, raw and broken and male. James Murphy, in the apartment next door, was crying. Not the quiet tears of grief, but the gasping, choking sobs of a man drowning in memories he couldn't escape. And Patrick Walsh, hearing another man's anguish, felt something shift inside his chest. because he'd thought he was alone in this. He'd thought the darkness that consumed him was his burden alone to carry. But he wasn't alone. James Murphy was drowning too. And if two men were drowning, maybe others were as well. Maybe the entire street was full of veterans barely keeping their heads above water, each one thinking they were the only one failing to be the hero everyone expected. Patrick set down the gun and pressed his ear against the wall, listening to his neighbor fall apart. And for the first time in 6 months, he felt something besides numbness. He felt rage. Not at James Murphy or at himself, but at the silence. At the conspiracy of pretending everything was fine when nothing was fine at all. He thought of Eleanor, his little girl with the serious eyes who'd stopped being a child the day he came home broken. What would his death teach her? That suffering in silence was noble? That when life became too heavy, the only option was to put a bullet through your own head? No. His daughter deserved better than that lesson. Patrick Walsh stood up from that table, left the revolver where it lay, and walked out into the hallway. He knocked on James Murphy's door, then Thomas O'Brien's door, then every door on their floor where a veteran lived. And when they opened those doors, suspicious and defensive, he said 4 words that would save 6 lives. I can't do this alone. What Patrick Walsh started that November afternoon would later be called by social workers as one of the first informal veteran support networks in Chicago. But in that moment, standing in the narrow hallway of a South Side tenement building, it was simply 7 broken men admitting they were drowning. James Murphy opened his door first. His eyes were red and swollen, his shirt soaked with tears. He looked at Patrick like a man caught committing a crime. The shame was thick enough to choke on. I heard you, Patrick said simply, through the walls. James's face crumbled. In that era, men didn't cry. Irish Catholic men from working-class families especially didn't cry. Crying was weakness. Crying meant you weren't man enough to handle what life threw at you. But James Murphy had just spent an hour sobbing into his pillow, because the sound of parade drums triggered memories of artillery fire so vivid he could smell burning flesh. I can't stop it, James whispered. The sounds, the memories, they're always there, Patrick, always. And I keep thinking if I could just make them stop, if I could just make them stop for 1 goddamn minute. He trailed off, but both men knew what he meant. Thomas O'Brien came out next. The medic who'd saved dozens of lives in France, but couldn't save himself from the nightmares. He leaned against his doorframe like a man who'd been awake for days, which he had. Sleep meant dreams. Dreams meant reliving the moment he held a 19-year-old boy's intestines in his hands and watched him die anyway. You hear it too? Thomas asked, not specifying what it was. He didn't need to. Every night, Patrick said. Every single night. William Clark's mother answered when Patrick knocked. The boy stood behind her, silent as always, his eyes holding the same haunted quality as the older men. He'd been 19 when he shipped out to France. He came back 20, but his eyes were 100 years old. Can William come out? Patrick asked. Mrs. Clark looked like she might cry from relief. By the time Eleanor came running up the stairs an hour later, her heart pounding with terror about what she might find, she discovered something she never expected. 7 men sitting in a circle in the hallway. Some on the floor, some on overturned crates, all of them talking. Actually talking. Patrick saw his daughter and his face transformed. For the first time in 6 months, Eleanor saw something in her father's eyes that looked like hope. Eleanor, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Come here, sweetheart. She approached cautiously, like walking toward a wild animal that might bolt. Her father opened his arms and she fell into them, breathing in the familiar smell of tobacco and soap and something indefinably dad that she'd missed so desperately. She felt his chest shake and realized he was crying, but not the silent hidden tears she'd seen through door cracks. These were open, honest tears of relief. "I'm sorry," Patrick whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry you had to be scared. I'm so sorry you had to carry that." Eleanor pulled back and looked at the other men. Timothy Murphy had arrived and was sitting next to his father. Sarah O'Brien was there with hers. Daniel Clark sat beside his brother William, translating the older boy's silence for the group. And Eleanor understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes to children, that something important was happening. "We're done pretending," Patrick told his daughter. "All of us. We're done acting like everything's fine when it's not. We're done suffering alone." James Murphy spoke up, his voice steadier than before. "We figured something out, Eleanor. We figured out that we're not broken. We're wounded. There's a difference. Broken things can't be fixed, but wounded things can heal, if they have help." The men had made a pact in that hallway. They would meet every evening after work. They would talk about the things they couldn't talk about with anyone else. The memories that played on repeat. The guilt of surviving when friends died. The rage that came from nowhere and consumed everything. The fear that they'd never feel normal again. But more importantly, they'd promised each other something else. They'd promised to keep living, one day at a time, 1 hour at a time if necessary. They'd promised that when the darkness became too heavy, they'd reach out instead of reaching for a gun. Records from St. Michael's Church would later document what became known as the Ashland Street Veterans Circle. Father O'Malley, who'd been a chaplain in France, recognized what these men were doing and quietly supported it. He provided space in the church basement when the weather turned cold. He never tried to tell them to pray away their pain or trust in God's plan. He just gave them a place to exist without judgment. But on that November evening, in that narrow hallway, it was just 7 men and 3 children forming a lifeline in the only way they knew how, by being honest about the war that followed them home. Eleanor felt something loosening in her chest. The weight she'd been carrying, the responsibility of keeping her father alive through sheer force of will, began to lift. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. "The photograph," she said suddenly. "The one from today? Can I see it when it's developed?" Patrick frowned, confused. "Why?" "Because," Eleanor said with the wisdom of a child who'd been forced to grow up too fast, "we need to remember this day. Not the parade or the banners or the pretending. This day. The day you all decided to stop lying. 3 weeks later, when the church newsletter was printed with that photograph on the front page, Eleanor asked Father O'Malley for the original. He gave it to her, confused by why a little girl would want such a thing. She brought it home and showed it to her father. "Look," she said, pointing to her own face in the image. "I'm not smiling. None of us children are really smiling, because we knew the truth." Patrick stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he flipped it over and wrote on the back in pencil, "The day we pretended everything was fine, November 11th, 1919. He handed it to Eleanor. "Keep this," he said, "so we never forget what it cost to stop pretending." But the real test came in December, during the first snowfall. Patrick woke at 3 in the morning from a nightmare so vivid he couldn't distinguish it from reality. He was back in the trenches. He could hear the screaming, smell the gas, feel the mud sucking at his boots. His hand automatically reached for the space where he used to keep his sidearm. The terror was absolute. The urge to make it stop, to end the horror permanently, crashed over him like a wave. For a moment he couldn't remember where he'd put his service revolver. For a moment he was going to find it. Then he heard it. A quiet knock on the wall. The signal they'd agreed on. James Murphy in the next apartment, awake with his own nightmare, reminding Patrick he wasn't alone. Patrick knocked back. Then he heard another knock from 2 floors down. Thomas O'Brien was awake too. Within minutes, 5 men were knocking on walls throughout the building, a Morse code of survival that said, "I'm here. You're not alone. We're still fighting." Patrick got out of bed, kissed Eleanor's forehead as she slept, and went to the hallway. By the time he got there, 3 other men were already sitting in the dim gas light. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. They just sat together until the nightmares faded, and the sun came up, and living through another night felt like the victory it was. That winter, no veterans on Ashland Street killed themselves. Not one. On surrounding streets, the numbers continued to climb. The newspapers still didn't report it. The government still didn't acknowledge it. But on one small street in Chicago's South Side, 7 men who'd fought in France were winning a different war by refusing to fight it alone. Eleanor watched her father slowly come back to life. It wasn't a straight line. There were bad days when he couldn't get out of bed. There were nights when the nightmares won and he drank himself numb at the speakeasy. But there were also good days. Days when he laughed at something Eleanor said. Days when he built her a new bookshelf from scrap wood. Days when he held her mother and cried and said, "I'm trying, Kathy. I'm really trying." And Catherine, who'd been holding her family together through sheer force of will, finally allowed herself to hope. By spring of 1920, the group had expanded. Word spread quietly through the veteran community. Men started showing up from other neighborhoods. The church basement meetings grew from 7 to 15 to 23. They didn't have a name for what they were doing. They didn't have training or credentials. They just had each other and the knowledge that sometimes survival is a collective act. Father O'Malley connected them with a doctor who'd served in France, who explained what was happening to their minds in ways that made sense. Shell shock wasn't weakness or cowardice. It was what happened when human nervous systems were pushed beyond their limits. It was injury as real as a missing limb, just invisible. And like any injury, it needed treatment, not shame. But the world outside their small circle wasn't ready for that truth. In 1920, there was no Veterans Administration, no PTSD diagnosis, no acknowledgement that war could wound minds as surely as bodies. These men were pioneers in their own survival, creating solutions that wouldn't become official policy for decades. July 4th, 1921. 2 years after that first Armistice Day photograph. Eleanor was now 10 years old, gangly and serious, with her mother's dark hair and her father's determined chin. The city planned another celebration for Independence Day. Another parade with flags and speeches about freedom and sacrifice. But this time, the veterans of Ashland Street made a different choice. They held their own gathering in the church basement, away from the noise and crowds and forced patriotism. 23 men and their families, creating their own version of celebration, one that was honest about the cost of freedom. Eleanor brought the photograph from 1919. She'd kept it safe in her Bible, looking at it whenever she needed to remember how far they'd come. She showed it to the other children who'd grown up in this circle of healing, children who understood that sometimes parents needed saving too. This was the day everything changed, she told them. The day we stopped lying. Patrick saw her showing the photograph and felt something catch in his throat. His daughter had lived through his worst moments and somehow emerged with a strength that humbled him. She'd carried the weight of his potential death at age 8 and never complained, never blamed. She'd just loved him through it and trusted that eventually he'd find his way back to himself. "Eleanor?" he called her over. She came, slipping her small hand into his larger one. "I need to tell you something." The room quieted. The other veterans knew what Patrick was about to say. They'd all talked about it in their late-night sessions when the nightmares were bad and hope felt impossible. That day in November, 1919, the day that photograph was taken, I had a gun on our kitchen table. Eleanor nodded. She'd known. "I was going to use it, sweetheart. I'd decided. I couldn't see any other way to make the pain stop." Eleanor squeezed his hand tighter. But something happened. I heard James crying through the walls, and I realized I wasn't alone. And then you came home from that celebration, and you looked at me with these eyes that saw everything, and I knew I couldn't leave you with that. I couldn't teach you that giving up was the answer. He pulled her close. You saved my life that day, Eleanor. Not by saying anything or doing anything specific, just by existing, by being my daughter, by giving me a reason to keep fighting when I didn't want to anymore. Eleanor buried her face in her father's shirt. At 10 years old, she was learning that love was sometimes about holding on when everything in you wanted to let go, about showing up even when it would be easier to disappear, about believing someone could heal even when they didn't believe it themselves. "Can I tell you something, Daddy?" she whispered. I was so scared. Every day I was scared you wouldn't be there when I came home. And I didn't know how to help you. I was just a little girl. You helped me by being exactly who you are, Patrick said, by not giving up on me when I'd given up on myself. Around them, other fathers were having similar conversations with their children. Timothy Murphy learned that his presence alone had given his father reasons to keep living. Sarah O'Brien discovered that her laughter had been the thing that reminded her father there was still joy in the world. Daniel Clark heard his brother William speak for the first time in 2 years. 3 words that changed everything. "Thank you, brother." The healing wasn't linear. It wasn't neat or tidy or complete. Some of these men would struggle for the rest of their lives. Some would never fully escape the shadows of what they'd seen in France. But they were alive. They were fighting, and they were doing it together. That night, Father O'Malley took a new photograph of the group. All 23 families, children and adults, gathered in the church basement. This time, everyone was smiling. Not the forced smiles of propaganda, but the real, hard-won smiles of people who'd survived something terrible and refused to be destroyed by it. Eleanor stood in the front row, holding the 1919 photograph in her hands. A picture within a picture. A moment of truth preserved so they'd never forget how far they'd come. But the story doesn't end there. Because truth has a way of spreading, even when society isn't ready for it. Especially when it's carried by children who haven't learned yet that some truths are supposed to stay hidden. In 1922, Eleanor Walsh was 12 years old and writing an essay for school about heroism. Her teacher expected her to write about soldiers on battlefields or presidents making grand speeches. Instead, Eleanor wrote about her father and the men of Ashland Street. She wrote about the war that came home, about the courage it took to keep living when dying seemed easier, about the strength in admitting you needed help. Her teacher gave her a failing grade, told her the essay was inappropriate, that she was dishonoring the veterans by suggesting they'd struggled with anything besides physical injuries, that true heroes didn't have the problems Eleanor described. Eleanor brought the essay home in tears. Patrick read it and felt rage build in his chest. Not at Eleanor. At a world that would rather pretend their suffering didn't exist than acknowledge it and provide help. He took that essay to the local newspaper. The editor, a veteran himself, read it and wept. He published it on the front page with the 1919 photograph underneath. The headline read, "The War That Followed Them Home. A Daughter's Truth About What Victory Really Costs." The response was explosive. Half the city was outraged. How dare a child suggest that America's heroes were anything less than perfect? How dare anyone imply that victory had come with psychological damage? The other half recognized themselves in Eleanor's words. Veterans from across Chicago began writing letters, sharing their own stories of struggle and survival. The Ashland Street group became news. Father O'Malley was inundated with requests from veterans wanting to join. Within 6 months, similar groups were forming across the city. By 1923, there were support networks in 10 major American cities, all sparked by a 12-year-old girl who refused to lie about what she'd witnessed. The government still didn't acknowledge shell shock as a legitimate condition. That wouldn't happen for decades. But seeds were planted. Conversations started. And slowly, painfully, the wall of silence began to crack. Eleanor's essay would later be referenced in early psychological studies of combat trauma. In 1952, when the first official recognition of what would eventually be called PTSD appeared in medical literature, researchers cited the Ashland Street Veterans Circle as an early example of peer support therapy. But in 1922, it was just a girl who loved her father enough to tell the truth. Even when that truth was uncomfortable. Even when it meant fighting against everything society said she should believe about heroism and strength. The years passed. Patrick Walsh never fully healed from what he'd seen in France, but he learned to live with it. The nightmares became less frequent, the panic attacks more manageable. He returned to his work as a carpenter, building things with his hands, creating beauty from raw materials in a way that felt like redemption. Eleanor grew up in that church basement, surrounded by veterans who'd become uncles to her. She learned that strength wasn't about never falling apart. It was about having the courage to fall apart in front of people who loved you enough to help put you back together. In 1929, when Eleanor was 17, Patrick Walsh died. Not from suicide or despair, but from pneumonia. He was 42 years old. At his funeral, 23 veterans stood as pallbearers, men who'd carried each other through darkness and were honored to carry their friend one last time. Eleanor found a letter he'd written to her, to be opened after his death. In it, he thanked her for saving his life. Not once, but every day. He thanked her for looking at him with eyes that saw his pain, but also his potential, for believing he could heal when he didn't believe it himself. And he asked her to continue telling the truth, even when the truth was hard. Especially when the truth was hard. Eleanor kept that promise. She became a nurse, working with veterans returning from World War II, and later Korea, and later Vietnam. She recognized the symptoms in young men's eyes, the same haunted look her father had carried, and she told them what her father's generation had learned. You're not broken. You're wounded. And wounds can heal if you let people help. She married in 1935 a kind man named Robert Chen who'd emigrated from China and understood what it meant to be an outsider, fighting for belonging. They had 3 children. Eleanor told them stories about their grandfather, the man who'd fought 2 wars and won them both, the one in France and the harder one at home. The 1919 photograph stayed with Eleanor her entire life. It became her most treasured possession. Not because it captured a moment of celebration, but because it captured the last moment before everything changed. The last moment of pretending. The last moment before truth broke through the silence. In 1968, when PTSD was finally beginning to be recognized as a legitimate diagnosis, Eleanor was invited to speak at a veterans hospital in Chicago. She was 60 years old, her hair gray, her hands marked by decades of nursing work. She brought the photograph with her. This was taken 49 years ago. She told the room full of Vietnam veterans, men barely older than boys, all of them struggling with horrors they had no words for. The girl in the white dress not smiling? That was me. I was 8 years old, and I was terrified my father was going to kill himself that day. The room went silent. He didn't. Want to know why? Because he heard another veteran crying through the walls and realized he wasn't alone. Because he chose to reach out instead of giving up. Because he understood that surviving isn't something you do by yourself. She held up the photograph. My father and 6 other men formed a support group in 1919. They didn't have fancy terms for what they were doing. They didn't have government programs or trained therapists. They just had each other and the courage to be honest about what they were going through. Eleanor looked around the room at faces that reminded her so much of her father's. Young and old at the same time. You're not weak. You're not crazy. You're human beings who've been through hell, and hell leaves marks. But those marks don't have to define you. You can survive this. You can heal. But you have to stop suffering in silence. After her speech, 17 veterans approached her. 17 men who'd been contemplating suicide, who'd thought they were the only ones struggling, who'd believed that true soldiers didn't have psychological wounds. 17 men who, because of one woman's truth-telling, chose to keep fighting. Eleanor died in 1994, at age 82. In her will, she left instructions for the photograph. It wasn't donated to a museum or historical society. Instead, she gave it to her youngest granddaughter, Sarah, with a letter explaining its significance. This photograph represents the moment when silence became too expensive, Eleanor wrote. When pretending everything was fine cost more than telling the truth. I hope you never have to carry the weight I carried at 8 years old. But if you do, if someone you love is drowning and you don't know how to save them, remember this. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is simply tell the truth about what you see. Sarah Chen Walsh, now in her 40s, keeps the photograph in a protective sleeve in her study. She's a therapist specializing in trauma, carrying on her grandmother's legacy in ways Eleanor would have been proud of. The photograph sits on her desk where she can see it every day, a reminder that healing is possible, that community matters, that truth-telling saves lives. And sometimes when Sarah works with veterans struggling with invisible wounds, she tells them about her great-grandfather Patrick Walsh, about how he sat at a kitchen table in 1919 with a gun and made a choice that would echo through 4 generations, how he chose life over death, community over isolation, truth over silence. She tells them that they're not alone, that what they're feeling has been felt before by countless others, that there's no shame in struggling, only in suffering alone. And when they don't believe her, when the darkness feels too heavy, she shows them the photograph. 7 children under victory banners in 1919. 6 of them performing happiness for the camera. One of them, a serious little girl in a white dress, telling the truth with her eyes. "This is my great-grandmother," Sarah tells them. She was 8 years old and she helped save 6 men's lives by refusing to pretend everything was fine. She taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're scared. Admit you need help. Admit that the war isn't really over just because the fighting stopped. The photograph never made it to any museum. It never became a famous historical artifact analyzed by scholars. It remains where Eleanor wanted it, in private hands, passed down through a family that understands its true value. Not as a piece of history, but as a testament to the power of truth and the strength found in community. On the back of the photograph, beneath Patrick's original inscription, Eleanor added her own words before she died. November 11th, 1919. The day 7 men chose to live. The day I learned that love sometimes means holding someone's hand while they fight battles you can't see. Remember this always, my darlings. Silence kills, truth heals, and you are never, ever alone. Today, descendants of the original Ashland Street Veterans Circle still gather every November 11th, not for parades or celebrations, but for a quiet dinner, where they share stories about the men who started it all. Patrick Walsh, James Murphy, Thomas O'Brien, William Clark, and the others who refused to suffer in silence. They toast to the courage it took to admit weakness, to the strength found in vulnerability, to the lives saved by a simple knock on a wall that said, "I'm here, you're not alone." Timothy Murphy's grandson is there, a Marine who served in Afghanistan and understands firsthand why his great-grandfather's story matters. Sarah O'Brien's great-niece attends, a social worker who specializes in veteran mental health. Daniel Clark's descendants come, carrying forward William's eventual healing, the boy who couldn't speak but learned to live anyway. And Sarah Chen Walsh brings the photograph, carefully protected, and tells the story one more time. About an 8-year-old girl who loved her father enough to be terrified for him. About a man who heard another man's pain and chose connection over isolation. about how 7 families on one street in Chicago created ripples that are still spreading a century later. The world has changed since 1919. We now have words for what those men experienced: post-traumatic stress disorder, moral injury, combat trauma. We have treatments, therapies, support systems that Patrick Walsh could never have imagined. But the fundamental truth remains the same. The truth Eleanor learned at 8 years old and spent her life sharing. Healing happens in community. Survival is a collective act. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone drowning in darkness is simply knock on the wall and remind them they're not alone. The victory banners in that 1919 photograph promised triumph. But the real victory happened 3 blocks away, in a tenement hallway, when 7 broken men chose to stop pretending and start healing. That victory didn't make the history books. It won't be taught in schools or commemorated with monuments. But it saved lives. It changed families. It proved that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought in silence, and winning them requires the courage to break that silence. Eleanor Walsh understood something at 8 years old that took the rest of the world decades to learn. That there are different kinds of heroism, that sometimes bravery looks like admitting you can't do it alone. That victory means nothing if the people who won it can't survive the peace. She kept that photograph her entire life, not as a souvenir of celebration, but as evidence of truth. Proof that on one November day in 1919, beneath those bright victory banners, at least one child refused to smile and pretend. At least one child bore witness to the reality behind the propaganda. And that small act of honesty, that refusal to perform happiness she didn't feel, became part of a larger story of survival. Sarah Chen Walsh sometimes takes the photograph out late at night when she can't sleep, when the weight of other people's trauma feels too heavy to carry. She looks at her great-grandmother's serious face and draws strength from it. From that 8-year-old girl who didn't have the luxury of childhood innocence because she was too busy trying to keep her father alive. And she thinks about all the children throughout history who've had to grow up too fast because war came home with their parents. All the kids who learned to walk quietly, speak softly, check for signs of danger in their own homes. All the sons and daughters who became caregivers before they were old enough to understand what they were caring for. The photograph reminds her that those children survive, that they grow up, that they carry forward the lessons learned in those hard years and use them to help others. That trauma can be transformed into purpose if you're brave enough to face it. There's a moment in everyone's life when they have to choose between truth and comfort, between honesty and performance, between speaking up or staying silent. For Eleanor Walsh, that moment came at 8 years old, standing under victory banners with fear crushing her chest. She could have smiled for the camera like everyone expected. She could have pretended everything was fine. But she didn't. She stood there with her hands clenched and her face serious and her eyes full of truth. And that choice, that small act of authentic presence, became part of a chain of events that saved lives. Patrick Walsh lived 17 more years after that November day. 17 years of building furniture and raising his daughter and showing up to the church basement every week to sit in a circle with other veterans who understood. 17 years of nightmares and flashbacks and hard days, but also laughter and love and moments of peace. 17 years he wouldn't have had if he'd made a different choice that morning. He got to see Eleanor graduate from school, got to walk her down the aisle at her wedding, got to hold his first grandchild and whisper into that tiny ear, "Your grandmother saved my life, little one. Remember that. Remember that love is the strongest medicine there is." Those 17 years multiplied across 7 families became a century of life that almost didn't happen. Hundreds of descendants who exist because their great-grandfathers chose to knock on walls instead of pull triggers. Thousands of people helped by those descendants who became nurses, therapists, social workers, teachers, carrying forward the lessons learned in that tenement hallway. The photograph measures 6 inches by 4 inches. Black and white, slightly faded, the edges worn from decades of handling. 7 children and a handful of adults, frozen in a moment that looks like celebration, but was really the pause before transformation. It's not worth anything to a collector. It wouldn't sell for much at auction, but to Sarah Chen Walsh and her family, it's priceless. Because it represents the moment when one family's private pain became a community's shared healing. When children's fear was validated instead of dismissed. When men's wounds were acknowledged instead of ignored. When truth became more important than appearance. Every November 11th, Sarah takes the photograph to the gathering of descendants. She passes it around the table, letting everyone hold it, touch it, connect with it. And she tells the story one more time, the way her grandmother told it, the way her mother told it, the way she'll teach her own children to tell it. This is where it started, she says. One girl refusing to smile, one man hearing another man's pain, one community choosing honesty over pride. This is proof that healing is possible, that connection saves lives. That the battles we fight in our own minds are just as real as any fought on foreign soil. And then they eat dinner together, these descendants of veterans and the families who love them. They share stories and memories and hopes for a future where maybe, just maybe, people who survive war won't have to fight so hard to survive the peace that follows. The photograph will be passed down again someday. Sarah's daughter will inherit it, along with the responsibility to keep its story alive. To remember what it represents. To use it as a reminder that truth-telling matters, that community heals, that love is strong enough to pull someone back from the edge of darkness. That's the real legacy of November 11th, 1919. Not the parades or the speeches or the victory banners, but 7 men who chose life. 1 girl who refused to lie. And a photograph that tells the truth about what victory really costs, and what it takes to survive it. Eleanor Walsh died believing that her father's story mattered, that his struggle and survival deserved to be remembered not as a failure or weakness, but as an act of courage. She spent 82 years proving that the hardest battles are often the ones no one sees, and winning them requires the strength to admit you need help. The photograph sits in Sarah's study now, in its protective sleeve, bearing witness to a truth the world is finally beginning to understand. That there's no such thing as coming home unchanged from war. That psychological wounds are just as real as physical ones. That healing requires community, honesty, and time. That sometimes survival itself is the victory. And when Sarah works with young veterans who remind her so much of the great-grandfather she never met, when they sit in her office unable to find words for what they're feeling, she shows them the photograph. She tells them about Patrick Walsh and the men of Ashland Street, about how they created something beautiful out of their brokenness, how they transformed their pain into purpose. You can survive this, she tells them, and they hear the truth in her voice. The truth passed down through 4 generations. The truth that started with an 8-year-old girl who was brave enough to be scared, and a father who was strong enough to admit he was drowning. The truth that saves lives, one honest moment at a time.